Tom Woods stands accused of many things, but laziness is not one of them. A historian and senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, Woods is the author of a dozen books, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. He's written curricula for the Ron Paul homeschool program. He co-hosts, along with economist Robert Murphy, the weekly Contra-Krugman podcast, which critiques columns by the New York Times Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, and he posts a new episode of the popular Tom Woods show every day. A champion of the Austrian School of Economics and devotee of Murray Rothbard, he was, he says, a moderate Republican, happy to lavish government spending on domestic programs and launch bombs at evildoers abroad. It was the 1992 presidential campaign of Pat Buchanan, who was against the Gulf War and other military adventures abroad, that began the transformation. Never one to shy away from a social media scrap, Woods got into an epic Twitter feud last summer with the leadership of the Libertarian Party, with one side calling the Mises Institute a gateway drug to white nationalism and the alt-right, while Woods and his allies mocked the Libertarian National Committee as a bunch of social justice warriors. Then something curious happened. After the LP's Mises Caucus failed to dislodge party chair Nicholas Sarwark at this year's national convention, Woods and his friends redoubled their efforts to influence the party from within. I sat down with Tom Woods to talk about his ideological journey, his involvement with the Libertarian Party, his controversial past associations with such entities as the League of the South, and his assessment of President Donald Trump, among many other topics.
So the first time that I saw you talk live was down the street from the Libertarian Party biannual, every 2 years, whatever that word is, national convention down in New Orleans. You were talking at a Mises Caucus kind of party, festival, there down the street, and you said something that's very interesting. I want to read it for the folks at home. We're not primarily advocating a slightly different public policy from other people. We're encouraging people to look at the world in a refreshing new way. So yeah, we won't get the 70 million votes, sort of a reference to the Libertarian Party, but maybe we get the 1 million people who say, I never looked at the world the same way again. Talk to me about what you mean by that and how it informs your work and also maybe your interest in the Libertarian Party.
Well, I find that a lot of times the political discussion we have is extremely narrow. And this is one area where I agree with Noam Chomsky, where he talks about manufacturing consent, that you're allowed to have a discussion that spans, 2.5 inches. So we talk about what form of taxation is better, or in foreign policy, we could have sanctions that we know will lead to starvation and malnutrition, or we could just have a bombing campaign. And that just seems like too narrow of a scope. And I'm suggesting that libertarians have a fresh new way to think about the world, because we actually ask, do we need institution X? Do we need institution Y? And if we do need these things, do they have to be provided the way they're traditionally provided? Could we not learn to interact with each other on a purely voluntary basis? Is society itself not in some way self-ordering? And incidentally, that's why I've taken a great interest in economics. And I feel like just the field of economics, when you understand it right, shows you something important about the way society is self-ordering. It shows you something about how social cooperation occurs spontaneously. That's not what we're taught. The model of society that we learn in school is that somebody with a bullhorn has to be barking out orders and then everybody obeys. And I think there may be a more attractive way of arranging society.
So some of this is it's a 35-yard line discussion, which is a perennial complaint about Washington. These are the parameters of acceptable adult discussion that's happening right here. Is part of what you're kind of saying, or even kind of living, that what you want to do is find and even emphasize the stuff that's over there on the 5 and the 10-yard line, or whatever the metaphor is now, the 85-yard line. Is it to look for those things that are outside that, to almost shock people's sensibilities into saying, hang on a second here, what's going on?
Well, exactly. It would be something like when people are arguing, should there be transgender equality in the military? I want to take it and make a meta question out of that and say, who wants to serve in the U.S. military these days, when you know perfectly well that basically none of it has to do with defending you and me. It has to do with going and attacking people you and I, as ordinary people, have no quarrel with. So it seems misplaced to be worried about who gets to serve in it. To the contrary, I say, no, you're thinking about things all the wrong way. So for me, that, by the way, was the biggest stumbling block to becoming a libertarian, because I grew up as heaven help me, a moderate Republican, which meant I was bad on every issue you could think of. I believed in a lot of social spending. I believed in hawkish foreign policy. I had conventional views on everything. I was very flaggy, all that stuff. And now I look back on that and it all just looks so cultish and just awful. And so I tend to go for, especially when I'm trying to reach people who used to be like me, I go for those areas that I know were stumbling blocks for me, like foreign policy. I used to think you got to be some kind of an unpatriotic commie if you don't agree with U.S. foreign policy. And I just hit them on that. I remind them, what is it that you guys say you believe in? You believe in absolute moral principles. You believe in stability. You believe in prudence. These are not words I would use to describe U.S. foreign policy, certainly since 2001 or 2. And that does sometimes get them to think. In fact, there was one of my favorite moments of my whole speaking career was I was out in Los Angeles speaking to a very mixed crowd. There were plenty of veterans in the crowd, and not veterans who were having second thoughts, but veterans who had their Operation Desert Storm hats on. And it came time in my remarks where I was going to say something about foreign policy, and I was second-guessing myself. I thought, well, this might not really go over well here. But then I imagined any of my heroes. Would they say to themselves, this crowd isn't ready for this? I thought, no. I spent the whole rest of the talk building up capital with them. And I said to them, you're better than this. I said, these sanctions on the Iraqis have caused so much human suffering, and nobody cares about that. And yet these people, their blood is as red as yours or mine. I mean, conservatives, you've got to be better than this. How can you be swept, you of all people, be swept up in this? And I got a standing ovation anyway.
What changed your mind? What knocked you out of this John Kasich sounding Republican?
A lot of people, the younger folks, for them, they say, well, I supported the war in Iraq in 2003 and then I had second thoughts. But for me, the war in Iraq that I grew up with was the war in 1991. Mm-hmm. And I was, 1990, I was a freshman in college, and I knew full well we had to get rid of Saddam, whom I had never heard of 3 months earlier, but I knew we had to get rid of him. And then as I watched that unfold, and we hear these stories of Iraqis being incinerated, with some kind of an agent that just burns them alive in the desert, and we're having these Bob Hope specials and tying yellow ribbons everywhere. But there was a part of me that thought, well, this is a great human tragedy for those people. And I know it's one thing to say we feel sorry about women and children who died, but you're not allowed to feel sympathy for the people, the soldiers. But I thought, I have no quarrel with any of these soldiers. I bet a lot of them are there against their will. A lot of them are like kids like ours who just feel like they have no other options. They go into the military. Plus, they were people's husbands and fathers, and now these people are widows and orphans. And I thought, I just can't imagine having a Bob Hope special and a big parade for this. I felt very uncomfortable about it. I felt sick about it. So I went in and I saw my European history professor, who at that time was Charles Mayer. His wife, Pauline Mayer, at MIT died a couple of years ago, I think. And I knew he was for the war, even though he was a left liberal. And so I wanted to know help me understand why this is okay. Because I couldn't believe that it could be wrong. I couldn't imagine the U.S. government could be wrong. Help me believe. And the best he could do is he said, well, there was a cover story in the New Republic that I ought to read that made a good liberal defense of the war. So I went and I read that, and that kind of held me over. But then when I came in contact with people, because I was never going to be on the left, that I knew. But when I found that there were people who were not on the left who also thought these wars were rackets, that started to get my attention. So I've always felt like I want to be that guy for other people.
So one of the things I was surprised about in seeing your speech was that you, like I should say, supported initially the war in Afghanistan after 9/11. I'm curious whether you look back at that, and whether I look back at that, but you're the one being interviewed here, as a mistake to have supported that moment. I
actually don't think I did. I don't think I did support that.
I thought I heard that in the...
Yeah, no, for me it would be more, I would favor some kind of Ron Paul style targeted...
market reprisals.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Okay.
I would favor that. Because I think when you and I were interviewed with Michael Malice, he brought up for me that Ron Paul had voted for the authorization of military force. But the thing, and here's the thing, by doing that, we were talking later about whether that gave him extra credibility during the debates, because if he had voted against it, it would have been just him and Barbara Lee. And I felt like I could see strategically why he might have made that choice to vote for that, because the Republicans would have eaten him alive. But on the other hand, they ate him alive anyway, so I'm not sure it really mattered.
But he managed to, I mean, that was the moment that galvanized
That was the thing
him.
that got him the attention.
I'll ask you a question I asked Rand Paul 5 years ago, and he slipped out of it because he's a politician. But looking back at now where you were at today, looking back at all of the post-World War II U.S. military conflicts, would you support any of that?
Wow. I guess at this point, I believe it or not, I would say I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I know that sounds unbelievable and crazy, but I just wouldn't. The Vietnam War is, of course, for a lot of people, an easy one. But for me, that was actually hard because as I was growing up, as I was in high school, again, I felt like I've got to learn how to defend the U.S. government come what may. So I read Richard Nixon's book, No More Vietnams, by which he means no more going in and not kicking the crap out of everybody. And I read that, and it's a really, really powerful polemic in favor of the war. And that satisfied me. Okay, all you people are liberal commies for not supporting the Vietnam War. But then you look back on it. I mean, you don't even have to talk about the destruction and the loss of life among people who lived there, but also just think about, from the point of view of people who favored that war, how did it turn out? I mean, it tore American society apart. So the conservatives who favored the war, what they got at home was a total social revolution, exact opposite of what any of them wanted. And then, okay, many, many Americans died. And then as a result, even after all the trillions of dollars and all, whoever knows in American money today how much it was, but it was a loss anyway. And yet, even though it was a loss, what strategic problem did it wind up posing? The U.S. was still in the same position it was before. Everything was fine. And now we have a, increasingly good relationship with Vietnam. So it was unnecessary. So I actually raised this. I had Pat Buchanan on my show, and I thought, doggone, I'm not going to have Pat on and not ask him about this. He was part of that White House, the Nixon White House. He was helping to make some of those decisions. And I said, Pat, this thing blew up in your face in every conceivable way. I mean, there's nothing a conservative could cheer as a result of any of this. And I almost got him to concede that it was possible that I could be right about that. And I thought, hey, that's as far as a guy who was in that White House, that is the closest I'm going to get to a victory.
It was his kind of post-Gulf War critique, post-Cold War critique of U.S. foreign policy, part of your journey from someone who was kind of a default supporter of this into
it was, because nobody could claim that Pat Buchanan was a left-winger. And so when Pat was saying, this war is all wrong, I remember thinking, what's wrong with him? Why doesn't he get it? We're all supposed to cheer the military. I really didn't understand it. But then as the 1990s went on, and there were sanctions placed on Iraq on a variety of different types of goods, and they were having really bad consequences, and Saddam was surviving fine through them, as we sort of all knew he would, to see that it was Pat Buchanan, this right-winger, who was saying, this is a moral outrage, and we've got to lift these sanctions. And and he's saying this at a time when people like Madeleine Albright weren't saying we should lift the sanctions. A lot of people in the left liberal establishment weren't saying that. But Buchanan said it. That made me think, maybe there is something wrong with this left-right divide. Maybe it doesn't explain everything. Because I would expect Noam Chomsky to say, lift the sanctions. I wouldn't expect Pat Buchanan. So in a way, he was for me what Ron Paul became for a lot of other people. He was the permission slip to question foreign policy. It's like, it's okay. You can still be an American in good standing, and you don't have to feel like you're Noam Chomsky. You can just be you and just believe there's something morally wrong here and speak out about it.
You reference Ron Paul. I see you as kind of maybe you don't, but as someone who sort of keeps the flame of the Ron Paul movement.
I take that as a compliment.
Or certainly talk about him a lot.
Yeah.
When I saw you talk, you said something that I found curious in New Orleans, that libertarians paradoxically need a leader. The way that you put it is, most people change or adopt ideologies not because they're getting led by some stuffed shirt, but because they're jolted by an articulate, true believer. So, man, I thought we were all like individualists.
Well, and the thing is, we are, but that's precisely why, without somebody to rally to. Now, I don't mean a leader who tells you what to think or orders you to do things, but a rallying point. Now, Ron Paul was a rallying point. And I think a lot of us were concerned that when that rallying point goes away, do we all just spin out and go our separate ways? I don't mind going our separate ways, but I don't like being in hostile camps, where there was a little bit of that among libertarians, but we were so interested in what Ron Paul was doing and so interested in how big the response was, at least compared to what we expected it to be, that I think it muted some of our internal criticisms of each other. I mean, I look sometimes at my Facebook friend list and I'd say, boy, I remember when I was friends with that guy, back in these days, and I still want to be friends with these folks, but without that center of gravity, some people flew off this way, some people flew off this way, and then it became, this is my group, this is my clique of people, and I'm going to defend them come what may. And then that, I guess what I was talking about in New Orleans was that I miss those days when we just said, yeah, we've got our differences, but man, this is an exciting moment that none of us thought we would live through, and we don't know where it's going, but we're going to ride this thing as long as we can.
I agree with you about the excitement of the moment. I'm, I think, more reticent about the idea of adhering behind one person. It seems to me that you always run the risk of a cult of personality anywhere.
That is true.
Ron Paul here, Ayn Rand back in the 60s or whenever, that's also a danger.
But but the fact is that without him in public life, he has a podcast and his daily show, the Ron Paul Liberty Report, but without him in public life, I don't think it's a coincidence that libertarians have scattered a lot more since then. So yeah, I agree. I don't want a cult of personality either. I mean, I was just telling you before we went on about the cult of personality around John Paul II was very bad for the Catholic Church, and the repercussions are still there. So I don't want that. But what was great about, now it's going to sound like I'm going into that anyway. What was great about Ron was that he would be fearless in taking certain political positions, regardless of whether they were going to hurt him or help him. He would just say, but this is what my philosophy leads me to believe. But then also on a personal level, I mean, the guy was, he would do pro bono medical work for poor people. I mean, he was just a sweet person. And that guy whom you saw on the screen, when you meet him in person, he's just the same grandfatherly, kindly man who, when he gets criticized or smeared or attacked, it just rolls right out. It just doesn't mind. I'm the total opposite of that.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know.
It's not
never figured that out.
Not obvious. So, what are your designs with the Libertarian Party? You are now a sustaining member, whatever that means, of the party. There is a Mises caucus, which isn't necessarily affiliated with, but the Mises Institute. But certainly y'all like each other here. What are your designs on this? Do you want to be the Ron Paul of the Libertarian Party?
Oh, no, I don't. Some people want me to, but I don't think I want to do that. But it just occurred to me one day that there's a parallel I draw. I think about Ron Paul himself. I mean, he was in his 70s in both of these campaigns, and he's out there campaigning like crazy. And for a guy who, I mean, he's in, we all know, very good physical condition, but he sleeps very poorly in hotels, so he's flying around with very little sleep, and he's doing all this stuff. There would be these anarchist libertarians, whom I consider myself one of, but I believe it's morally okay to vote. I do believe that. And some of them don't. And so they would say, well, I love Ron Paul, but I won't vote for him. And I thought, he's an old guy who's busting his rear for you. Make an exception for this guy. Well, I thought the same thing when I thought about all these people doing this thankless drudgery in the Libertarian Party, getting petitions signed, getting signatures for ballot access. I mean, this is not fun. And it reminded me of that, the late Dr. Feldman, who gave that extraordinary little talk in 2016 at the convention.
This is Mark Allen Feldman.
Mark Allen Feldman.
He waved, sorry.
And he had this amazing little few-minute thing, and he referred to those, get those petitions signed in the rain, libertarians. And I thought, I am a libertarian, and I believe this stuff. And here are the foot soldiers who've been doing this thankless work for years and years. I'd like to help them. And I guess I'd like to feel like I'm in a political home where instead of just having to settle, well, this is the best I'll find. Well, but regardless of what their vote total is, if these are the people who are saying what you believe, why don't you join them? So that was the motivation behind it. And then I do want to try to help out the Mises Caucus people. And the Mises Caucus people, they basically are radical libertarians who want to make sure that economics is a major part of the libertarian messaging, for the reasons I mentioned earlier. That I think economics does really ground us. It reminds us about what's fundamental, which is social cooperation on a large scale. Also, the name Mises they chose partly because Mises got along well with anarcho-capitalists like Rothbard, even though Mises was a minarchist. And that's how they view themselves. They want to get along with people who might fall somewhere along that divide and just work together the best they can. And they want to focus on, they want to talk about the central bank issue because nobody else does. And Ron Paul put that front and center. They want to do that. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see the party become exciting. I feel like, especially based on my own experience, the public needs to be jolted rather than lulled to sleep or comforted by somebody who seems respectable. I'm not saying you should gratuitously be not respectable, but I mean, we don't necessarily have to be nominating somebody who comes from, a political background necessarily. And in particular, I think in my own experience, it wasn't people who said, well, Tom, you might be 12% mistaken about it was people who said, look, you're dead wrong. And you're looking at this the wrong way. I mean, your instincts are good, but you're not following where they ought to lead you. And that was what shook me. And I feel like that probably is what people, for people who, we have a country filled with people who think John McCain is somebody they want their children to emulate. And I wouldn't want that. Those people need to be jolted. They don't need to be patted on the head and told we just need to cut the capital gains tax a few points.
I think there are a lot of people in the party who are equally reticent about nominating another former moderate Republican governor after they've done that the last couple of times. But they might also point out that, hey, last time we tripled any vote that there's ever been before. There's kind of a tangible momentum of the party right now. They have 170 elected officials. They're putting more people, candidates this time around than any midterm ever. Like, maybe that was a good step there. Do you think it was a bad step to have Gary Johnson as the
I'd rather have Gary Johnson than Bill Weld. There, I said it. I said the name Bill Weld. I think Gary Johnson has many fine qualities, and I think it would be a good thing for him to get elected to the U.S. Senate, although they're trying some shenanigans to try to stop his momentum in New Mexico. It's true that, look, there's no arguing with, they did get a lot of votes, that's true. And I'm not sure how much this translates into party membership and activism, because is this the kind of person you say, my life was changed forever when I encountered the philosophy of Gary Johnson? I don't think so. And I would rather have somebody who's going to build the ranks of the people who will go out and do all that hard work that needs to be done. And and also I want it to be somebody who loves the ideas, who doesn't just feel like, well, I'm fiscally responsible, so I'm sort of like a libertarian because I also favor gay marriage. That is so a caricature of what we are. We're not just drawing arbitrarily from the other two. We have our own, we're the most internally consistent people there are out there. And I want our nominee at least to be somebody who is well-read and well-versed in it and can't wait to get out there and spread that message, instead of you ask him about a famous libertarian author and the guy stumbles. And I'm not saying he has to be a PhD in history or in economics, but at least have the curiosity to be self-taught and be on fire for it and excited. And that 4 years after your last campaign, you're much better and more effective because you've been studying and learning and reading and practicing your speaking. And then 4 years later, it turns out you're the same guy? Come on. You owe the ideas more than that.
Fact check. I have met one person of note who is totally turned into a libertarian because of
Larry Sharp,
Larry
right?
Sharp,
Yep,
exactly.
That's
exactly.
right.
He will tell that story.
That's right. Larry Sharp is killing me for that, but that's okay. Look, as long as it worked, I don't care how it worked.
Here's a question: why not Trump? There are people in your orbit who are more, let's say, friendly disposed towards Trump. I wanted an extra ly in there. I will, and since we were talking about Ron Paul before, I want to read you an extended quote from the Washington Post by your sometimes colleague Lou Rockwell at the Mises Institute in an article by Dave Weigel about Justin Amash, just to click off as many boxes as possible. And this is pretty interesting, I think. Trump's victory, Lou Rockwell says, vindicated Ron Paul because Trump used many of the themes that Ron Paul stressed throughout his career, though unfortunately Trump did not deploy these in a consistent way. Opposition to elite control calls for a pro-American foreign policy that avoids intervention in quarrels that do not concern us. Opposition to PC and cultural Marxism, and concerned with the Fed manipulation of the economy as themes straight out of Ron Paul's playbook. Do you agree with that assessment, or how would you differ from that assessment?
Well, definitely some of it sounds like Ron Paul, but the problem with Trump was he's the opposite of Ron Paul in his interest in ideas. Okay, this is what I was just getting done talking about. I mean, Ron Paul has read every book there is, right? Whereas I've heard rumors about the number of books Donald Trump has read. Now, again, for what he did in the private sector, he probably didn't have to read a lot of books. Fair enough. But when you become president and you're going to be pushing ideas, you've got to be grounded in those ideas. So on the one hand, sometimes he could say things about foreign policy that would make me nod in agreement. And then the very next day, it would sound like he was saying the opposite. Or he would say something about the Fed. Oh, we got to get more control over the Fed. And then the next day he'd say, but I'm a low interest rate man. But then, okay, so then what's the point of getting control over the Fed? So that's the problem, is that I could isolate some parts of Trump that do sound like Ron Paul, but then I could isolate some parts that make me completely crazy. And so that's the thing, is that because he's not grounded in it, he's flighty, and one day he's here and one day he's there. And what proves this is that, remember there was that anonymous op-ed in the New York Times the other day about somebody, supposedly a senior official in the administration. And I don't think the New York Times is lying about that.
Well, senior officials, a malleable term.
That's true. But I think it would hurt them tremendously if it turned out that it was a guy who was cleaning the floor or something. But when that thing came out, it just served to remind me that Trump has surrounded himself, through choices made by himself alone, by people who are at odds with him on his major issues. And that again goes to show he's not even steeped in who the personnel would be if he wanted to have a foreign policy like the one half the time he claimed he wanted. Or on economic policy, he's got people in there like Larry Kudlow. I don't think Larry Kudlow has been against low interest rates pushed by the Fed. I could be wrong about that. I don't think I am. So why is he doing that? Again, it shows that he's a mile wide and an inch deep. And that's precisely the kind of guy who gets manipulated by the people around him. And if he can't even pick decent people around him, this is going to end badly.
So I'm going to pigeonhole your three issues as being war, economics, and the Fed. And maybe Fed
something like that. Something like that. Yeah.
So how do you evaluate Trump on those?
Well,
so far, just his actual record in office.
He's done a lot of bombing, but he hasn't gotten the U.S. into any new wars. So unfortunately, by the metric of the last few presidents, that makes him okay. When the Syria strike hit, I did an immediate episode on that. I'm very unhappy about that, and very creeped out by the media response that he's finally presidential.
Brian Williams, I think, was had his hand over his heart.
It's so weird. I just don't understand. I mean, it really, for every once in a while, you think maybe they are lizard people. What other explanation could there be? Let's see. I'll skip the economy because that's the trickiest one. But on the Fed, all right. Well, I mean, I guess he appointed Jerome Powell. But these are basically establishment picks. There's not going to be any major change there. And again, Trump has been saying he wants. Now, supposedly there's been talk that he wants to interfere with the political independence of the Fed, but I think that independence of the Fed has been kind of a sham anyway. But I think on the Fed, what signal has he been sending other than keep the interest rates where they are? So that's not, I'm not good with grading on an A to F scale, but let's just say he would be getting a progress report going home. And then on the economy, there are some good things. The spending issue is just not. He's apparently just not interested in cutting spending. But I think that was pretty obvious from his campaign.
He didn't run on.
He didn't talk about spending, and he certainly didn't talk about the entitlements, because I think he felt like his base depends on those entitlements. Why would it occur to me to go after those? So I think if anybody was expecting that, they shouldn't have been. So on that, he's not very good. But you do hear a lot of behind the scenes talk about deregulation in a lot of areas. So that certainly is good. And the number of pages of regulations that exist seems to have been cut. So I guess I'm in favor of that.
Are you worried about trade wars?
I sort of am. I'm not sure how far he's going to go with this, or if he really. I mean, it could be that he genuinely. I hate to attribute 4D chess to him because it's getting tiresome at this point. Oh, he actually has a secret plan all along. Oh yeah, that's why he surrounded himself with his own enemies. What kind of secret plan was that? But it could well be that he's using that in large part as a bargaining chip, and and he knows the dangers that are involved. I don't know, but yeah, that would be pretty bad, especially because he's making people think that if we have more taxes, this will make you more prosperous. These are the same conservatives who for years would tell you that taxes inhibit prosperity. But if it's a sales tax on imported goods, this makes you richer. This is not good to lead people down this road.
There's some resistance within libertarian circles. The pragmatist caucus is kind of at loggerheads with the Mises caucus, or at least was at the convention. People always get very excited for a half a second and then move on to whatever the next conflict is. Yeah. But I reached out to a member of the pragmatist caucus and said, I'm interviewing Tom Woods. What's your question?
Oh, good.
So buckle up. You have a history of promoting organizations and individuals like the League of the South, Hans Hermann Hoppe, sorry if I mispronounced that, Hans, Gary North, Chris Cantwell, and Stefan Molyneux, that a lot of libertarians regard as anti-libertarian and bigoted. Why should the party, which has achieved its peak success under leaders like Nicholas Sarwark and Gary Johnson, ditch them in order to follow your lead? Before you answer, if there's anything that's specifically inaccurate about that you want to address before getting into a broader thing.
Yeah, no, well, I'll do that as I do it. I mean, I wouldn't quite say that it's true that I have so-called promoted a lot of those people. I've had a lot of different people from a lot of different backgrounds on my show. I've done, as of this recording, well over 1,200 episodes.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I should be in an insane asylum. Sometimes I look around the world, I feel like I already am. But all right, so yeah, I might as well come out and just address this. When I told you about being a moderate Republican in like 1990, that is where I started. That's where my dad, who was a blue-collar worker, that's what he got me to. He got me to see the problems with communism and whatever. And I thought, well, I got to be a Republican for sure. And then after that, I dabbled a little bit in libertarianism. For a couple of years, I went to IH Institute for Humane Studies seminars. I went to the Mises University program. And then for probably 7 years, I was more in the paleo-conservative camp. So I did actually believe in, heaven help me, protectionism. I have a piece I wrote that I'm embarrassed about, where I'm clearly indicating that protectionism will make workers wealthier. I'm sorry. I was wrong about that. There are a lot of things from those years that I look back on and say, darn it. I wouldn't say, in fact, all through the 1990s, if you look through anything I wrote, at no time do I refer to myself as a libertarian. I liked a lot of libertarians. I was friendly with them, but I thought their heads are in the clouds. I mean, the sort of thing people say about libertarians now, that's what I believed at that time. So yeah, you can dig through. I wrote an article in an academic journal about capitalism that I'm not proud of. So yeah, you can.
What's the problem with capitalism?
Well, I was taking the right-wing traditionalist argument against capitalism, that it uproots people.
Oh, right.
That sort of thing. And so I look back on that, and these are the very kinds of things that make me crazy today. Most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time when people are going back and saying, well, look at what Wood said, it's always from the 1990s. Yeah, I know. Before I was a libertarian, Matt, I was a terrible libertarian. Now, the whole League of the South thing has blown up because of what's gone on recently. The story there, I'll just tell it very quickly, but I have, if you go to tomwoods.com and you type in League South into the search bar, I talked about the story. 1994, I was in my senior year of college, and my old friend Jeff Tucker called me up and said, there's a meeting of academics going on in Tuscaloosa where they want to talk about radical decentralization and even secession. And of course, that I did favor as a paleocon in those, and as a libertarian, I also favor radical decentralization. But I thought that's the way you strike at the U.S. empire. You break it into pieces. So I said, yeah, sure, let's go. And one of the people there was Forrest McDonald, who was a professor at the University of Alabama at the time. Forrest McDonald held the position of Jefferson Lecturer of the National Endowment for the Humanities. That is the highest honor in the humanities the U.S. government bestows. So a young historian like me going to a meeting with Forrest McDonald, well, who wouldn't, right? I mean, it's Forrest McDonald. Nobody thinks Forrest McDonald is a white supremacist. In fact, when he died, I forget how many years ago, the New York Times didn't even mention this because they all know it's Forrest McDonald. So we went, and my view was this group should not be a Southern group. I said we should have a group that favors decentralization. If Hawaii wants decentralization, let's do that. Anywhere in the country where people are interested in it. But most people voted that it should be a Southern organization because the South has a history of decentralization. So, all right, well, that's better than nothing. So I said, okay. because I had not lived in the South at that point. I grew up in Massachusetts. I got my PhD in New York. But I thought, well, I had just taken American intellectual history with a guy named Donald Fleming. And Fleming had us read I'll Take My Stand, which is the book by the so-called 12 Southerners, where they talked about valuable things about the Southern tradition, none of which involved slavery, obviously. And I read that thinking, geez, I had always thought the South was just, stupid, ignorant rednecks. And then I read this thing and I thought, whoa, okay, there is something valuable worth preserving here. I'm sure people will understand this is my motivation. It's not the case. So in the early days of the organization, there was nothing wrong with it. I know there are some people who will say, if it's a Southern organization, it must be wicked. That is not true. There were entirely mainstream people there. Eugene Genovese called Clyde Wilson one of the top 10 Southern historians of our age. And he was there. I mean, what are you going to say? What, Clyde Wilson we're not allowed to talk to? So it was basically academics. Donald Livingston was there. He's probably the greatest living David Hume scholar. So basically, it was a dorky organization of PhDs. But now, in recent years, it's become something rather different. And the president of the organization, who is the same, recently admitted this. And in a way, it helps me that he's being honest about it. That he said, some people say I've taken the league in a whole new, radical new direction. Well, you're darn right I have. And then he lists, now we're going to do this and this and this. And we're going to invite this person and that person. And the thing is, now it reflects on everybody who was ever associated with it. I mean, anybody who knows me or my persona or has listened to me for any length of time knows that I wouldn't be involved in something sinister. But the problem is, I will not apologize because the group I joined was a bunch of nerdy academics like me. And there's nothing wrong with that group that I joined. So I'm not going to apologize for that. And I could save myself an enormous amount of grief if I would just say to you, Matt Welch, I did the wrong thing and I'll never do it again. I will not apologize because I am sick and tired of cowards who get cornered, who say, oh, I'm so sorry I did or said the wrong thing. I'm not going to be part of that. And even though that means I got to carry this with me to my grave, I'm not doing it. I will not back down on that. But so now I realize what that means is I have to go around correcting people and saying, well, there's more nuance to the story. It's hopeless. It's one of these things where there is no solution, there is no problem. There's nothing I can do about this at this point, other than assume that people of goodwill who know me will say, all right, I'm sure that's the situation. That can't be right. Now, the rest of these people that they mention, I don't know if we want to spend all this time going through each and every one of them,
No.
but the point is, yeah, okay.
I think there's a broader question here. There's a let's say a category of critique of people, which is that it's kind of, is there an alt-right pipeline to libertarianism, and is Mises broadly part of that pipeline? So address that.
Sure.
Do you think that's a thing, and is it a problem?
First of all, let me just note that if you look at tomwoods.com/episodes and you look down that list, it is a wide, broad array of people from all over the libertarian movement, because I'm friendly with almost everybody. There are some people who kind of have it out for me, but the things they say, my listeners say, who could they be listening to that I don't think they do listen to me. That's the thing. I think the less people listen to me, the more they dislike me. So that's a problem. But this alt-right pipeline thing, I used to say there's no such thing as an alt-right pipeline from libertarianism to the alt-right, if that's what you mean. I used to think that there was no such thing. Now I think, okay, all right, I think there probably is to some degree. There has been, I remember in my Facebook feed, there was, looked to me like also a libertarian pipeline to Bernie Sanders. I had a lot of people in my feed who suddenly loved Bernie Sanders. And I thought, how could you like Bernie Sanders and also have been for Ron Paul? And I think it was just the anti-establishment thing. And so that anti-establishment thing can take you to Ron Paul, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, and maybe even the alt-right. So there is that strain in libertarian, because let's face it, we're not the establishment. And so we carry just inherently an anti-establishment strain. So I think that could well be the case. But the question would be, how extensive is it? And does it really matter? You look at when we had the Charlottesville event in 2017, we had a lot of people very, very concerned about this growing movement. And then and whereas my view was, this is not a big issue. I don't think there are that many people involved, and the people who are involved have zero influence anywhere, And if word comes out that they're involved, their careers are destroyed. I'm not worried about those people. I think we're overreacting. And I think this year, 2018, when they tried to do Charlottesville Part 2, and it was, a couple of dozen people and 1,000 protesters. I mean, I think that vindicates my point that we're getting much too worked up about a problem that I think is going to resolve itself and fizzle out. So if there is a libertarian to alt-right pipeline, if it's a group that is barely, these days it's hard to see what content they're producing. Does it even matter anymore? I don't think they're a presence. Now, I could be wrong. Maybe they're going to have a big revival in 2 years. I don't see where that's coming from.
You talk about being a paleo conservative. There's kind of an overlap to a paleo libertarian strategy that was associated with Murray Rothbard and Lew Rockwell and maybe not many others. Looking back, were there errors there? Was that a good strategy on their part? How do you assess that period, your involvement with it or not? But just looking back at it, was that a good thing?
Well, I was very young in those days, but I did go to the John Randolph Club a couple of times, and I loved it. The John Randolph Club was an organization that I don't exactly know who the founders were, but Rothbard must have had a hand in it. And the idea was they were going to take libertarians like Rothbard, and then they were going to take some of the paleocons, like at Chronicles magazine, like Tom Fleming and Clyde Wilson and Paul Gottfried. And they were all going to meet and exchange ideas and say that now the Cold War is over, a major division point between us has gone away. And these were conservatives who said, now the Cold War is over, we can go back to being a normal country. And they were shocked at how many conservatives were saying, well, we have 28 other enemies we want to use this military on. So Rothbard had said, since 1956, and I found a private letter of his where he says, I'm coming to believe that the war-peace issue is the issue of the whole libertarian business. So he'd believed that for 35 years at that point. So I went to these meetings, and they were just a blast. They were so much fun. That's where I met Bill Kaufman, who I think has written for Reason in the past.
He worked as an employee for him.
Oh, that's right. And he worked for Reason. And Bill is uncategorizable politically. I don't know what he is or how he describes himself. But
definitely a Kaufmanologist.
Yeah, right. But Kaufman, he was the sort of guy I would never have met otherwise, because he wouldn't go to a libertarian conference, but he'd come to this. And I know that the easiest thing in the world to say is, well, this was a bad decision and this shouldn't have been done. But I think Paul Gottfried is brilliant. He is a absolutely amazing European intellectual historian. Clyde Wilson is one of the best Southern historians you'll ever find. He was the editor of the Calhoun Papers, which is a big scholarly project. That's a big deal. Tom Fleming and I had a bit of a falling out years later, but I still think he's a genius. I think he writes. I wish I could write like Tom Fleming. And I look back on these folks and I say, no, I'm glad I met them. And plus, remember, the internet was like, we had email, but we didn't really have the internet in those days. And in those days, as in Rothbard's day in the 1960s, when he felt he had to have an alliance with the left. Well, we don't really need alliances so much anymore, because you don't have to think to yourself, well, it's really expensive to put out a magazine, so I better have an alliance with the people who have that magazine so I can get published there and we can work together. Anybody can start a website now. And so we don't have to have it's not as urgent that we have alliances, so-called. But Rothbard in the 60s felt like he had to reach out to the left. Again, mostly over the war issue, because he was not comfortable with National Review. Well, likewise, he's not comfortable with a lot of people in the early 90s, and he thinks war is, for me, the key thing. Let's reach out to these people. I don't think that's bad. The fact that he found other non-interventionists, I support that. I think that's a good thing.
There's a bit of the cultural smash mouth going along with it, though. It felt like at that time, reading through some of the papers and documentation, it's, hey, we can get these people if we appeal to their sense of, runaway criminality among certain classes of people like that. That didn't seem as nice and interesting as, hey, let's bond over war.
In general, I would say the overwhelming amount of stuff that came out of that was on a very high academic level. Like if you looked at what Chronicles magazine was writing in those days, Chronicles magazine is what made me anti-war. And they were old-fashioned traditional conservatives. And they were conservatives who would be a little bit, sometimes they could be anti-capitalist for the reasons that I gave. Either, they want the mom and pop shop rather than the big box store and things like that. And the thinking was the libertarians will try to educate them on economics, and then maybe they can educate us on whatever. It could be history or whatever, intellectual history. And what I think happened was the libertarians really did try to learn things, but the paleos just stayed with their same economics. Like almost none of them budged. So I think Rothbard started to throw his hands up in despair after a while that, we've kind of kept up our end of the bargain. You're really not going to learn any economics after all the effort we put into this. So I think but that's mostly what it was. It was mostly talking about that stuff. Trying to teach each other. This is what we know that you don't know. And geez, if Rothbard's teaching you economics and you're still not getting it, well, okay, I think we've done what we can do here.
You mentioned that you can just start your own damn things now. You've had your podcast for 5 years.
Yeah.
Now, tell us a little bit, what were you thinking when you started, and what have you learned in this?
Oh, geez. Well, I used to be a fill-in host when Peter Schiff had an actual terrestrial radio show. And I would actually go down to a radio station in my town, and I would host for him. And it was a blast. I just loved doing it. I took calls, and it was great. And I have a ton of people who say, that's how I discovered you. I listened to Peter Schiff, and then you were guest hosting. And so then I decided to do, like my own spin-off. I would be the Jeffersons to his All in the Family or whatever. I was going to be the spin-off. So I came up with the Tom Woods Show. And at first I thought it would be live and I would take calls. And I hate calls. I don't hate calls. I don't like listening to shows where people take calls, because sometimes the caller goes on forever and it's not interesting. So, but I thought I'd like to be that guy who somehow produces something every single day. Every single weekday at least. And this was at a time when I was engaged in the most time-consuming project I have ever done, which was I created 400 videos on history for the Ron Paul homeschool program. And that took me 2 years. It's an absurd project. I don't know, I must have been crazy to take it on. But I thought, in order to do this project, I'm going to have to retreat from public life, as it were, to the extent that I was in it, because I'm so busy. I need to produce something finite, not that long, and doable every day so that people don't forget about me while I'm in hibernation doing this project. So that was the thing. The odd thing was I started the podcast because I was so overwhelmingly busy, but I felt like maybe this will be something that keeps my name out there every single day. And so I've just kept it up, and somehow here we are at episode 1200 and whatever. And then Bob Murphy, my friend Bob Murphy and I, we do a once a week podcast called Contra-Krugman. We take Paul Krugman's New York Times column and we critique it. And once in a while he's right, and we're honest enough to admit that. And what I love about Bob is that he will bend over backwards to try to find a way to show that his opponent may be saying something sensible. He's not looking to beat down straw men. And we never on the podcast say Paul Krugman's a stupid idiot. That's what a lot of people say in our Facebook threads. But we actually don't say that, because he's not a stupid idiot. He's wrong, but he's not a stupid idiot. And I'm really proud of that podcast too, because Bob and I have this excellent banter, and he makes fun of me because I don't have a degree in economics. My degree is in history. And we just have fun doing it. But we're teaching a lot of really good economics week in and week out. And we never run out of material, because Krugman is our weekly foil. And that's been tremendous. We do an annual cruise based around that podcast called the Contra Cruise. So it's with the podcast as the center, I've had a lot of things that kind of revolve around it that make it, that allow me to have a nice, comfortable life.
So you wrote a book called Meltdown. We're on year 9 of largely tepid, but recently a little bit more heated recovery.
Yeah.
I want to overcharacterize and say that Austrian economic school people are a little bit more
bearish,
apocalyptic than some of their friends associated with Chicago school. So tell us, are we going to be eating cat food soon?
No, I don't think so. But I will say on that apocalyptic thing that a lot of times it tends to be investment newsletter people rather than the academics who are actually working within the Austrian school. Because I'm across very few of them who go around saying hyperinflation's around the corner. I don't think people should be predicting hyperinflation. I don't think that. And
my very worst Reason cover in my tenure as editor there was Inflation Returns, which I think I put in 2009.
Well, it's not to say it's never going to come back, but I don't think it's going to be Weimar Germany, certainly. But given that fundamentals of economic policy have not changed, I do think there will be, obviously there's going to be a correction. We all know that. I don't know when that's going to be. But then side by side with the correction, there's the fiscal issue looming, of course, related to the entitlement problem, which is a really, really extreme time bomb. You've heard, I'm sure, that, the Lawrence Kotlikoff estimates of in excess of $200 trillion in the hole. That I'm actually more concerned about than another recession, because that's going to involve, a recession you come out of eventually. But if that's really true, if he's right, these programs are that underfunded, you're talking about wrenching social changes that almost nobody's prepared for.
Yeah, I think are just, 6 to 10 years out from having to give people a 25% haircut on Social Security, just kind of as a opening bid. Is the Libertarian Party the vehicle for beginning to address this, or one of several? Because it really seems like the two major parties have stopped all even rhetorical nods in that direction.
That's why the Libertarian Party has to do it, even though, again, it's not going to win them popularity contests. But given that they're probably not going to get the 70 million votes, at least they can be a channel of information to responsible people around the country saying, isn't it interesting that neither one of these people will say a word about this time bomb? How can you trust them? I've sometimes thought that the LP should, when you appeal to the young, the problem is the young just don't vote. For whatever reason, they don't vote the way the older folks do. But the fact is, the interest in libertarianism is so much greater among the young than it is among the old, that I've thought they should have an ad where, two oldsters, pull up in Buicks, and, one's a red Buick and one's a blue Buick, and they represent the old parties. And then you have some, young people in a sports car going by, and I would start off by saying, remember how there used to be 3 television stations and, 2 major, outlets for news and
the
this
answer
and
is
that?
no, they don't remember.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But what you say is, in your parents' day, they had this, and they also had 2 political parties. So you make it seem like that's just so silly and backward. That's what my mom and dad did. I got to break free out of that. Something to appeal to their natural teenage rebelliousness.
So in closing, are you optimistic or pessimistic in this moment? It's a very strange political moment that we live in, governance moment. The 2 major parties seem to be just kind of ripped up and remorphing, and both of them kind of are victim of a semi-hostile takeover. At least Bernie Sanders didn't quite win, but the heart of the Democratic Party seems to be going in that direction. Yeah. That can be seen as like a really interesting revolutionary ferment. It can also be seen like, my God, it's all coming down apart around us, and people don't behave very well when things are in that type of crisis. What is your kind of view? That's true.
I did just see a statistic saying, when they asked Democrats, would you like to see the Democratic Party go more in the direction of Barack Obama or Bernie Sanders? And it was 69-28 Obama. But I think there it's just nostalgia, more, for a president that they trusted and liked by and large. So, because I think that is a bit of a misleading number, because I do think this democratic socialist movement is just starting to gain steam. Yeah, I have the same concerns you have, that and also the country is, I know it's a silly cliche to say the country's divided, but my gosh, it's like a burning hatred that a lot of people have for a lot of other people, and it's mutual. It's a burning hatred that when I was growing up in the 80s and then going to grad school in the 90s, I don't remember that. We argued, but I don't remember it being, like just the other day there was an event, or I guess a few months ago, Jordan Peterson had an event at Queen's University in Canada. And there were people on the outside of that building who'd been removed for disruption. And they're pounding on the doors and windows, and they're saying, lock them in and burn it down. Now, I don't remember that happening when I was growing up. I don't remember
not the psychology professors.
Yeah, right. Of all possible people, right? Mild-mannered psychology. So that does concern me. But the thing that makes me happy and that makes me feel good about this situation is you have to remember, and it's important for young people who grew up with the internet to remember this, that we live in a world now where, with a couple of, I'll grant you, major exceptions, in almost any part of the world, you can get access to almost any book you might want, instantly downloadable. We're moving to a point where more and more books will be available like that. The spread of ideas. Could you imagine our ancestors in this movement being in a situation where they could distribute their propaganda, in a good sense of that word, to anybody who might be interested in consuming.
I mean, the nerve center was within walking distance from here. It was Laissez-Faire Books.
That's right.
You needed that bookstore to be
right. I used to order from Laissez-Faire Books. Yeah. And I would order by writing them a check and putting it in the mail. And it was just luck. It was just fortuitous that I happened upon Laissez-Faire Books. Whereas now, I mean, the fact that Reason Magazine has this ReasonTV, or that I'm just some guy who wrote some books and people liked them. So I have a show where, in principle, in fact, I look at the statistics of all the countries where a substantial number of people listen. This is a miracle. And I know it's disappointing that a lot of people in this situation just want to watch cat videos. All right, but that's probably going to be the case no matter what the state of technology is. But there are a lot of minds out there that are going to be exposed to the most liberating set of ideas ever, thanks to this. And so that makes me think, well, if we still lose even after that, we can at least say we gave it the old college try, but we've got a fighting shot for once in our lives.
On that optimistic note, thank you very much, Tom Woods. It's the Tom Woods podcast, the Contra-Krugman, not Krugman, but Krugman podcast. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt.